Hello everyone, in this video I'm going to be talking about the effects of a few psychoactive drugs. Now, psychoactive drugs are defined as those that affect the brain and personality to an extent by either increasing or decreasing what we call postsynaptic transmission. Now, in another video I spoke about the structure of a nerve and the synapse, and we said that you had, very basically, if we had one axon terminal here, we said that a nerve impulse would travel down the axon terminal and then it would spread to a second axon, if you like. So that impulse would be generated in a second impulse across this gap here called a synapse. We said that there was vesicles, little sacs containing neurotransmitter, that when that action potential reached this axon terminal would move down and fuse with the membrane and release neurotransmitter across the gap. And when that neurotransmitter combines with the receptor on the postsynaptic, so the postsynaptic meaning after the synapse nerve, the postsynaptic membrane of this second nerve, it would generate a second impulse in that nerve. That's what I said in a previous video about the synapse and nerve transmission. But psychoactive drugs have a very distinct effect on this particular structure. So we're going to focus in on this a little bit more. I'm going to draw this a bit larger. So in fact, I'll draw this and then we'll talk about what we've got. So this here is meant to represent a pre-synaptic neuron. So this is our presynaptic neuron. Let's just put that in place. We've got these little vesicles or sacs with blue dots in. Those blue dots represent what's called neurotransmitter. So we'll just put that in place here. So we've got neurotransmitter there. And then I've drawn this sort of little square thing. I'm going to refer to this square in just a few moments. I'm going to explain why exactly I've drawn this green square here. So exactly what that is. So first of all, we've got our presynaptic neuron, and then we'll imagine there's a gap, and then this gap is the synapse, clearly. So this is our synapse. And then what we have, let's say, just very crudely drawing, on the membrane of the postsynaptic neuron, we've got particular receptors. I'm just drawing this very rough. But we're imagining that these red circles that I've drawn are neurotransmitter receptors. Now what I want to do is think about the effect of psychoactive drugs on this sort of picture. So we're going to categorize them into two. We're going to first look at inhibitory drugs. Now, inhibitory drugs can work in two ways. They can actually mimic inhibitory neurotransmitters. So they can work, I'm going to put the numbers what level sort of they work at. So put number 1 here. So inhibitory drugs can work by mimicking inhibitory neurotransmitters. So we'll put that here, mimic inhibitory, and I'll just put NT for neurotransmitter. Now what they do is increase what's called hyperpolarization of the postsynaptic neuron. What that ultimately would result in would be fewer action potentials. So if these inhibitory drugs copy or mimic these inhibiting neurotransmitters, you get fewer action potentials set up. So you get less nerve impulses travelling, if you like. Now, an example of a drug in this kind of category would be alcohol. So alcohol can act to mimic inhibitory neurotransmitter. But you could also get blocking of excitatory neurotransmitter receptors. So you can actually have, I'll just shrink the screen a little bit just to put this in here. So you can actually block excitatory neurotransmitters. So also at the receptor level, what you can do is prevent the propagation, the further movement, if you like, of action potentials. So by preventing the propagation of action potentials, you can actually block or stop neurotransmitters that have an excitatory effect. So drugs that act a bit like this, psychoactive drugs that have an effect like this include opiates or heroin, which block pain pathways by competitive inhibition with pain-related neurotransmitters. So opiates like heroin actually block pain pathways by competitive inhibition with pain-related neurotransmitters. So they bind to the receptor and actually block or stop excitatory neurotransmitters from acting, and they prevent propagation of those action potentials. So there are two ways that inhibitory psychoactive drugs affect the synapse. They mimic inhibiting neurotransmitter or block excitatory neurotransmitter. Then we've got a sort of second category, if you like. So I looked at inhibitory drugs, and now I want to consider some excitatory. So drugs that are going to excite at the synapse, if you like. So we're looking at excitatory drugs. Now, one relates to this little green dot that I put up at the top, or green square that I drew in the presynaptic neuron. One way that certain excitatory psychoactive drugs can take effect is by blocking the reuptake pumps for neurotransmitter. So that's what that number one is. It's sort of a block, if you like. So you can actually block the reuptake pumps for, and I'll put NT again, for neurotransmitter. So that neurotransmitter ends up remaining in the synapse. And an example of a drug that does it would be cocaine. In fact, cocaine's effect on dopamine. So when you have cocaine, it blocks that reuptake pump for the neurotransmitter. So dopamine, an excitatory neurotransmitter, stays within the synapse. So an example of this would be cocaine. You could also mimic excitatory neurotransmitters. So like I had number one in blue where I said mimic inhibitory neurotransmitters, you could mimic excitatory neurotransmitters. So what happens is you would increase depolarization of the postsynaptic neuron. So ultimately you get more action potentials being set up. So a greater number of nerve impulses, if you like, travelling down that axon. And a good example of that would be nicotine. So again, we'll just shrink the size a little just to be able to write this in. So one of the second ways that you can do this is by mimic these excitatory neurotransmitters. So you mimic excitatory neurotransmitter, and the example that I gave there for that one was nicotine. Apologies if the writing looks a little bit small and illegible in certain parts of this video. That's be cocaine there. And the third way that excitatory psychoactive drugs could work would be to block inhibitory neurotransmitters. So like I had in blue, number 2 over on the left hand side of the screen, I said you could block excitatory neurotransmitter to have an inhibitory effect. These excitatory drugs could actually start to block inhibitory neurotransmitters. So again, I'll write this one here. So this would act again where I've drawn a red 3 in a circle. So at that receptor level, you could prevent inhibition of action potentials. Now, a good example of a drug, so we'll just write down here, block inhibitory neurotransmitter. Now, a great example of a psychoactive drug that would do that would be caffeine, because caffeine competitively inhibits adenosine. Now, adenosine is an inhibitory neurotransmitter. So when you want to fire less nerve impulses, if you like, adenosine can act as an inhibitory neurotransmitter. But if you have caffeine, caffeine is a psychoactive drug that will competitively inhibit adenosine. So it will block inhibitory neurotransmitters from acting. And that will prevent inhibition of action potentials. So that will act as an excitatory drug. So an example there would be caffeine. When I draw these arrows to the actual receptors, I'm not necessarily meaning that these psychoactive drugs are acting physically on the receptor. When I say work at receptor level, like this, for example, caffeine, it doesn't block the receptor as such. It goes to inhibit the adenosine, the actual inhibitory neurotransmitter. So by inhibiting the inhibitory neurotransmitter, it allows excitatory transmitter to bind to the receptor, to allow for action potentials to be set up, just to make that clear. Now, some drugs can also increase the amount of neurotransmitter released. Generally, an example of that is nicotine, or they can stimulate neurotransmitters to be released without needing an action potential to activate those vesicles. Now, drugs that would do that, drugs that can stimulate neurotransmitter without needing the action potential to activate those vesicles, would be amphetamines and methamphetamines. So amphetamines and methamphetamines actually can get those vesicles to fuse. So I'll just colour this in green. These vesicles to fuse in the presynaptic neuron with the membrane and release the neurotransmitter without an action potential being required. So certain psychoactive drugs can do that, have that effect. And many drugs act in more than one way, such as heroin, because heroin can inhibit, as I said before, pain pathways, but it also excites the reward or pleasure pathways. So one thing to know is that certain drugs can have sort of multiple actions. But this video is just a short one on psychoactive drugs, those that affect the brain and personality, and to talk about how they do that by increasing and decreasing postsynaptic transmission. Okay, hope that helps.